Some people say beans and grains didn't exist until 10,000 years ago and therefore are not really our natural foods and our bodies aren't programmed to eat them. And therefore, we're actually meant to eat animal products. What does the best science have to say about this?
I love that question. It's a great question. I guess science has two things to say about that. Number one is it's not true that we didn't eat beans and grains back then. As a matter of fact, we probably have at least a dozen studies showing that, in even middle Paleolithic period, people were consuming grains and beans. As a matter of fact, I believe it was Mount Carmel, Israel. There are very specific locations where they show the predominant foods at certain seasons were actually beans or grains. So they were used in those times, in Paleolithic times. And the second thing that I would say is just because something wasn't consumed in Paleolithic times doesn't mean it's not healthful or an important food for humans today. People lived about 2 to 4 decades in Paleolithic times. And I think obviously the wild diet, whatever people were eating back then was probably reasonable for human health, like the diet of other animals that eat in the wild. We eat what we're meant to eat to some extent. But I think the mistake that people are making is assuming that humans just lived on animals. First of all, during the first 20% or first 80% of the Paleolithic period, humans were vegetarians. They didn't have the skills to kill and consume animals. So they might have gotten a little bit of dead meat from something that had died, or some insects. That was about it for the first 80% of the Paleolithic period. If you look at nutritional anthropology research, the work by Melvin Connor and Boyd Eaton is very, very interesting. During the last 20% is when they gained skills to add hunting and started consuming animals. But even with that, the estimated intake of fiber was about 70 to 150 grams a day. That's more than what vegans consume. Where does fiber come from? It comes from plants, period. Just plants. So they were eating a lot of plants. Secondly, vitamin C was around 500 to 600 milligrams. The estimates for potassium were in the 1997, they were estimated at over 10,000 milligrams. And then in the 2010 study at about 6,700 or 7,000, no, it was about 7,000 milligrams, I believe. That's way higher than vegans consume. And where does potassium come from? Well, mostly fruits and vegetables. And so, really and truly, this idea that they were just chowing down on these big chunks of animals is a myth. Certainly, there were some hunter-gatherers, especially in the northern parts of the world, that probably only consumed 35 or 40% of calories from carbohydrates and were consuming more meat. But even those people were consuming about 500 milligrams of vitamin C and 70 grams of fiber. This is a large amount of plant matter. People closer to the equator were probably consuming closer to 65% of calories from carbohydrates, which means the vast majority of their calories came from plants, and probably closer to 150 to 200 grams of fiber. So there's no question that I think that the idea of what Paleolithic people actually consumed is not quite accurate. And of course, even if it was, the animals today are not the same as the animals, the wild animals they were catching. Today, our domesticated animals are about 30 to 40% of calories from fat in their meat, whereas it was closer to 10%, and it is closer to 10% in wild animals. Very big differences. Even the levels of persistent organic pollutants that are, all of the chemicals that, the hormones that are added, the antibiotics that are added into our, domesticated animals today, this is not the same as the animals people were eating in Paleolithic times. And even the wild plants were very different. They were more concentrated in fiber. They were lower in sugar. They were more concentrated in trace nutrients. And so It's not, you're not eating the same thing. If you think you're eating the same thing, you're not eating the same thing as people did in Paleolithic times. And it makes sense that if you want to get to the levels of vitamin C and potassium and fiber that people were eating in Paleolithic times, you need to up your produce intake big time. And your consumption of whole grains is not a bad idea, because that's one of the more, and beans is the most concentrated source of fiber. It helps us to get to those numbers. So you need to really look at how we're evaluating the Paleolithic diet.